Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a whole swathe of European countries are growing their armies, for some even by conscription, particularly those within spitting distance of Moscow. But last month, confirmation came that we really were in a new era when President Macron announced that France was on the move too, and also mobilising.
Nous ne pouvons pas revenir au temps de la conscription, mais nous avons besoin de mobilisation.
So what should the UK do? And who should we take our steer from? Welcome to The Journal and The Journalist. I'm Tom.
And I'm Patrick. Well, we've got a brilliant guest to chew over all of this. Oliver Moody is the Times' Berlin correspondent. But more pertinently for this conversation, he is the author of one of this year's best-selling books, Baltic, The Future of Europe. Here it is. It's absolutely brilliant. My friend Peter Frankopan said that I had to read it. So you should too, and buy it.
I'll put it back on our shelf, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom.
A growing shelf of
that was
important
done.
tomes.
That was done with such effortless, smooth transition. So, Ollie, thank you very much for joining us on the pod.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on and for very generously referring to the book as a bestseller. I don't want to lull the listeners into a false sense of security, though. So if they are worried about its sales figures, please do go out and buy a copy.
So, Oliver, tell us a little bit about how this book came about, because you've obviously been in Berlin since 2018, but your patch really is, I guess, it's the Baltic Sea region. What caused you to focus, to take this particular lens while you were sitting in Berlin?
I think if we're honest with ourselves, then a lot of British people would have to admit that until 2022, this part of northeastern Europe between Germany and Russia was slightly terra incognita. I remember the first time I was in Estonia on a NATO exercise with the British Enhanced Forward Presence Battle Group out there. The NATO press officer passed me his phone, and it was a Times article that a colleague had published that day. And on the map, we'd managed to get Estonia and Lithuania mixed up with each other, which is just sort of token of, I think, how little attention we tended to pay this region. But after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine started, I began to realise that it wasn't just that these countries had been warning about precisely this for a very long time indeed. It was that because of their history and their geography, they are so much better adapted to living in this world of instability where security really has to be the top priority that a lot of the West European countries are, and there are a lot of things that we can learn from them.
And did your perception of the threat change as a result of sort of walking around this region, or were you reassured?
I think it did change. It became more acute. But the thing that really drives it home to you is reading the history. The Estonians will tell you that their territory has been attacked by the Russian state and its precursor more than 40 times over the past 800 years. And even just looking at the 20th century and the way that these countries have been repeatedly steamrolled by the Germans and by the Russians in various incarnations, you realise that a short memory is not a luxury that they can afford themselves. And that while we might think that what happened in the middle of the 20th century was a long time ago, for them and also for the Russians, it is very much present still.
And the title, so the second bit of the title is The Future of Europe. Is that you saying that you think this is how Europe's going to go, or that we should take a lesson from them?
I mean it in a passive sense and in an active sense. And the passive sense is that this is militarily the most vulnerable part of NATO. And if we are unable to maintain deterrence around the Baltic states, then we are going to be very hard pushed to sustain deterrence anywhere else. And that would have terrible consequences, not just for NATO as an alliance, but for the European idea in its broad sense, not just meaning the EU, but the whole sort of concept of European coherence. And then also in an active sense, in a more optimistic sense, that these frontline states, the Baltic states, Finland and Poland, can actually teach us a lot, not just about how you make your society more resilient, but also about how you try and seize the initiative and make the best of this rapid and unpredictable change that's being thrust upon us.
So Ollie, there's a lot going on around Europe at the moment with various different nations growing their armed forces. An awful, actually. It's really interesting. We don't hear a massive amount of it here in the UK. It doesn't mean it's not happening. We can do a little bit of a grand tour with your expertise in a moment. But first, we should probably just clarify some terms, just in case people don't quite understand what we mean, and there are quite a few of them. Patrick, you're the expert on these, perhaps. Conscription, mobilisation, voluntary forces. What's the difference between the lot of them?
It takes a nation to fight a war. And so this is about mobilizing all of the levers of national power in order to protect your society, to ensure that you're resilient in what could be, very hot wars, and then could be the sort of hybrid conflicts that we're seeing at the moment and constant attacks below the threshold. But either way, that's what I mean when I talk about mobilization. That's what I mean. Conscription is one part of that preparedness. It's one model, it's one lever that you can pull on. And I guess the simplest way of thinking about the different models is, you've got what most people would understand, which is full or near universal conscription or national service. It's what we did in the years after the Second World War and clearly during the First World War. And that is usually men, but increasingly women, doing 6 to 12 months. And it delivers a very, very large trained reserve. You then move sort of down the ladder to a more selective model. And we'll talk about some of the nations that are doing that. But that's where you it's a more limited form of national service or conscription, where you take a selection of the population.
But it's still mandatory.
Yes, it's still mandatory in this particular example.
You have to do this. It's the law.
And you either find yourself doing it because you've drawn the short or the long straw, depending on how you look at it, in a lottery, or you've actually been selected because the state thinks that you've got a particular set of skills, or you come from a part of the country where they want to do that. Then you've got sort of more limited versions below that. So you've got very, very short sort of crisis conscription, which might just be a burst of 2 months, just to give people enough skills to know one end of a rifle from another, to have some basic knowledge. And then you get different models where it's more about national service. So that's the sort of range. What all of those models do is they base on your existing armed forces. And armed forces in most countries in Europe consist of regular soldiers, sailors and airmen, or aviators as we should call them, which are people like me, who are professional soldiers who spend their whole lives thinking about preparing for and often involved in operations. And you have reserves who are part-time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're any less skilled. In fact, in some cases, the skills that they have from their civilian lives cover gaps that we don't have as professional soldiers. So reserves are absolutely critical. And then you've got a pool that we call our strategic reserve, which is anybody who has done some form of military service, whether it's regular or reserves, are liable for call up to the age of usually around about 60. So I am, you'll be pleased to know, still liable, although only just.
Well, look, Ollie, let's look across Europe. Let's do this a little bit of a grand tour, because this is precisely what you cover on a daily basis. Some schemes are mandatory. You're forced to sign up and serve for a certain period of time. Others, as Patrick's saying, are voluntary. Talk us through who is doing what and why and when. Perhaps if we can start with the Baltic states, a particular area of expertise for you, of course. And by that, of course, we mean Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia. What are they doing?
Yeah, so they have mostly gone for full-fat conscription, based on the Finnish model, which is really the one that everyone holds up as the European conscription model par excellence. So pretty much all young men at the age of 18 face mandatory military service of something between 6 to 12 months of basic military training. And interestingly, the Estonians have started to move a bit beyond that. So they now have compulsory national defence education in schools. When you're 16, you just turn up to classes and learn military history or a bit of Clausewitz or whatever. And
that's
you learn
brilliant use of their time.
Well, it is great. I actually went to one of their winter training camps, and it's like kind of mini conscription. So they're kind of smoothing the pathway into national service. And so by now, all three of the Baltic states do have mandatory conscription systems.
I agree with you. The Finnish model is really impressive. So just to put to give you a sense of the scale here, Finland actually has a very small standing professional army. But when they mobilise, they can mobilise 250,000 in 6 weeks, and they have just under 1 million total trained manpower that they can draw on. And I went out with my opposite number, Pasi Välimäki, who's still actually the army chief, great guy, to visit some training up in northern Finland. It was absolutely, I'll use the word, it was absolutely Baltic, freezing cold. And what struck me, I spent some time with an armoured vehicle crew, and what struck me was the 4 guys in this tank, so they were the crew of the tank, were on their recall. So they'd gone through training together 5 years earlier, all through their national service, and they were then called back up again to refresh their skills, and it was the same 4 people on the same tank as they had been 5 years before. I mean, that is really smart and sophisticated because it draws on the cohesion.
And Finland's a fascinating example, isn't it, Ollie? Because they have a concept of total defence. Patrick said a tiny army, but this extraordinary ability, because they're so invested in the subject matter of the subject, to deliver this whole of society approach.
Yeah, they call it the comprehensive security strategy. And this is where the leaders of business, civil society, and the government and the armed forces sit down and draw up a list of what every part of society has to do in a crisis. And that's not just necessarily a Russian invasion. It could be a natural disaster. It could be losing a large part of the electrical or water supply or whatever. And you have a very detailed list of what is stored where, what factories can be switched over to making military-grade winter boots or ammunition or body armour if you need them to, what individual citizens are required to do, what is expected of them in terms of preparedness, where the bunkers are, all that kind of stuff. And on one level, it's just very practical to have those plans. On another level, it also contributes, I think, to a psychological sense of readiness, where you just have the calm of everyone knowing that this has been thought through and that we've all planned it out.
And then there's Norway, and we have our own resident Norwegian expert, actually. In fact, a Norwegian. Patrick is half Norwegian, Ollie. I don't know if you know that. He even speaks fluent Norwegian, although we keep on trying to persuade him to talk something. Can you give us a few words, Patrick, just to prove this?
Norge har en kjønnsnøytral vernepliktsmodell der både menn og kvinner innkalles til sesjon, og et utvalg av de mest motivert og kvalifisert gjennomfører 12 til 19 måneder førstegangstjeneste før de overføres til hjemmevernet eller mobiliseringsreserven.
Okay, and I apologise profusely to all our Norwegian listeners if Patrick's just come out the whole of expletives about what he really thinks about me, but rough translation, Patrick?
It was a quick description of how Norway's selection process works in for their model. I mean, I think I talked about this on the podcast before. I went with my cousin Lars, and we skied the border between Russia and Norway, and we were hosted by the Norwegian army at various points along the way, because they were a little bit concerned, since it was immediately after Skripal, that I might get lost, or there was just a sense of a sort of heightened threat, and I was the commanding the field army at the time. Anyway, off the back of this, we spent quite a lot of time in these very, very small, isolated huts, as well as the company headquarters, where they patrol the border. And it was an incredibly impressive model, because what I learned is that they select people for conscription in Norway on the basis of, first of all, can they do the job, but also in terms of promoting societal cohesion. And the role that they do, particularly on the border guard, is so exciting and so much fun that people volunteer for it. There is a very, very intense process to try and get in. And from their perspective, they end up spending the summer months going around on quad bikes and on boats, and are cut completely loose and only report in and come in every 6 weeks or so. And they do extra time in order to do that. They go up to 19 months because they enjoy it so much. And they then get sort of societal recognition. There are real credits, if you like, social credits for serving. And it's the same team of 4 or 6 people who go through training together. They live in the same room. It's a mixed-sex room. They go off to these huts together, and they're really impressive.
Ollie, what's your standout experience or story you came across when covering mobilisation across the Nordics or the Baltics? Some particular thing that really struck you?
I think it was being on a Finnish winter training conscript base near the Karelian border with Russia, actually only a few weeks ago. And it's about 90% young guys, 10% young women, because it's voluntary for young women. And they all have to hand their smartphones in when they go off base. And they will get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and they will go for a run, and they will operate out there in temperatures that can go as low as minus 35, minus 40 Celsius. They'll be swimming across rivers, as long as the rivers aren't frozen over. And the adaptability of young people, the extent to which they are capable of this and they thrive on it, and they forge bonds and friendships to the point where the commander initially kept the girls and the boys apart for sort of, safeguarding reasons. But the girls actually asked to be in the barracks with the boys in the end because they felt that they were missing out on the camaraderie. It's really quite something to see that happening to a group of 18-year-olds.
When you look at the global map, of all the countries of the world, conscription is still the majority system. So Russia has it. All the ex-Soviet republics pretty much has it. A lot of South American countries, a lot of African countries. And really, it's only just Europe, I guess, and the US. In fact, America still has conscription on the statute books. They just choose not to use it. So we're actually almost in the minority as a sort of a continent there. But, Ollie, that leads us on to the difference between mandatory schemes and voluntary schemes, because not everyone in Europe, as they desperately try to grow their armed forces, is doing it in a mandatory way with conscription. Poland is a really good example, isn't it? They've got a massive army. They don't conscript, they don't force people to join it. But also, France and Germany have made some big announcements in the last few weeks, Oliver.
That's right. So Poland has done this through the simple expedient of jacking up the basic pay for recruits by about 50% in the space of 1 year.
That's always going to work.
So it just became, a much more socially prestigious and better paid job. Germany is fascinating because it had, of course, universal male conscription until 2011. So my cohort, I'm 36, was one of the last to go through that machine, by which point no one really took it that seriously. Most of my German mates got sort of sick notes from the doctors saying that they'd very inconveniently developed a gammy leg at precisely the moment they were due to be.
Or bone spurs. Bone spurs, perhaps, Oliver.
Yeah, bone spurs. But we're recording this on Monday, so 3 days ago, the Bundestag has just approved a return to a much, much, much more limited form of national service, where they already have voluntary national service. They will now have a system where gradually all 18-year-old men in each year group will be called up to be mustered. That means you go to your local barracks, you get examined, they take your blood pressure, very basic sort of tests and that sort of thing. They check your motivation to serve. And then they will call up the most motivated and fit 5,000 of them, which is basically what Sweden does. But there were really widespread protests that same day in cities across Germany by teenagers because it is crashingly unpopular among the young. And I was actually in a East German school talking about my book the day before, and I asked this group of 120 16, 17-year-olds, how many of you would be prepared to fight if your country was under attack? And it was less than a third. Mm-hmm. And then I said, how many of you would be prepared to fight if one of your NATO allies in Europe was under attack? And it was 3 kids out of 120.
But they've got a long way to travel, haven't they? I mean, we've all grown up with Germany with an extraordinarily, if not pacifist, tendency, certainly an absolute rejection of everything that led to their history. So it doesn't surprise me that those attitudes, and I suspect you'd probably have got similar responses during the Cold War.
Well, or in the 1930s. This is what I said to them. We didn't have opinion polls of teenagers back in 1939. But we did famously have the Oxford Union debate. This house would take up arms for king and country, where the motion was defeated on the eve of war. And by most of the historical accounts I've read, that reflected a general mood among Britain's youth that flipped extremely quickly once the war actually broke out. So these anti-militaristic leanings can definitely change.
Yeah, I mean, we'll definitely go into explore that a bit more. The German scheme I read a little bit about, I thought was fascinating. Another element is by getting every 18-year-old to go and do a medical and to cough in front of the doctor and do lots of other things as well, of course. You also introduce young people who've had no experience of military life whatsoever, never been anywhere near a barracks, to military life, albeit in a tiny way. This is a barracks, this is how it looks. And do you know what? It's not so bad. It can be quite fun in the hope of increasing volunteers into the ranks without having to force them. Because, of course, that's the ideal, isn't it? And that's a similar scheme in France, isn't it? The President Macron announced a week back, didn't he? The problem with the French announcement, a few days before President Macron's big announcement, his chief defence staff, brand new one, General Fabien Mandon, made a similar speech, which he thought was obviously going to be rather helpful, in which he said, France really does need to understand, with the threat of war coming now over the horizon again, with Russia where it is and the Chinese where they are, France really needs to accept that they may need to start losing its children again, losing our children to protect itself from these sort of new threats. And that phrase caused absolute uproar, as you imagine it would. But Patrick, General Mandon is obviously right, isn't he? Because as a basic fact of war, you can't fight one that's casualty-free. But do you think he was right to use those particular words? France has to be ready to lose its children again. And would you use those sort of words if you were still in the job of Chief of the General Staff?
Well, I mean, I agree fundamentally with his message. I mean, we've talked about it, that I got myself in trouble quite frequently as CGS by trying to make precisely this point. You know, the need to be prepared, to recognise that in a world that is far more dangerous, if you're not prepared, if you can't deter, this is precisely the consequence of what's going to happen. I wouldn't have used the language around sacrificing its children, but that's very Gallic. I mean, look at the words of their national anthem. This is how the French speak. So I understand. I think I know where General Mandon was coming from, because you've got to cut through the societal complacency, the sort of amnesia that we have as a generation about the danger that we face and the need to be prepared for it. And sometimes you've got to use shocking language. So I think he probably did the right thing.
If I could just interject, basically building on what Patrick was saying, there's a senior Finnish official who said recently that the country has the highest level of military mobilization of any European society since ancient Sparta. And there is a definite gradient that you see in the willingness to acknowledge the realities of war and to fight for your country that gets higher the closer you get to Russia. And I think the real problem that the political leadership and military leadership in Western European countries are struggling with is we all know that that every state is a frontline state, that the reality of modern warfare and the kind of hybrid mechanisms that Russia would deploy in a NATO-Russia war mean that Britain and Germany would also be very much in the firing line, right? But how do you explain that to the public in a way that mobilizes support but isn't alarmist or doesn't unduly scare people? And I think certainly in Britain and Germany, the leadership is still really wrestling with those questions and hasn't yet found an answer.
I think you're being kind, Oliver. I don't think our leadership are wrestling with this at all. I mean, it was one of the most important recommendations that came out of the Strategic Defence Review, the need to have a conversation along the lines that you just so eloquently described. And what have we had? We've had one speech from the Prime Minister in February. We've had a Chancellor who gives a budget speech that doesn't even mention defence, despite the backdrop that we see behind us. And we've had, rather than a national debate, we've had a national muffling, because the people who should be making this debate, who should be contributing to it, who should be explaining, educating and reassuring, have been gagged. So none of the service chiefs, none of the defence officials are allowed to speak out. So I don't think we are having that conversation. And of every single measure that we should undertake to prepare ourselves for this era, this is the single most important, and it's completely absent.
Well, that leads us really rather nicely onto something I really wanted to talk to Patrick about, because there is a consensus that everybody's armies needs to be bigger. There is no consensus how on earth to go about it, but everyone agrees it's because of the same threat, Russia. Now, when military figures have in the past started to make this point and open up that space for politicians, Sometimes the politicians leap on it, like Boris Pistorius did. In Britain, they get squashed. In fact, there was a certain general in January 2024 who made an impassioned speech for the need for a citizen army. He said, we're in a pre-war period. We need very much now to start preparing our entire population to get ready for a potential fight. And that means growing the size of our armed forces, not just with conscription. In fact, that general is right here with us. It's Patrick Sanders. And Patrick, just a little bit of the politics there. What happened when you made that speech?
I mean, the speech was slightly misreported in that all the headlines focused on conscription. So it interpreted my comments talking about the need for a citizen army. And I was drawing parallels with Ukraine and what we're seeing there, but also across other parts of Europe and the Nordics and the Baltics. The need for national preparedness, for national resilience, for a national defence plan, and the need to mobilise. So that's what I was trying to convey, but the reporting went straight into general calls, CGS calls for national service. And it caused a hullabaloo. It was reported quite widely, and I was then slapped down by Number 10. We have no plans for national service. And the Prime Minister said, I disagree with General Sanders. 4 months later, the very first manifesto announcement from the Conservative Party going into the election, that short notice election call they made, was for national service. And Rishi Sunak, who I saw subsequently, did at least have the grace to apologise for the discontinuity.
He did apologise to you personally, did he?
Yes, I mean, not in public.
Right.
It was unfortunate because it trivialised the debate, because it hadn't been thought through. It wasn't a wider conversation. And then, of course, the opposition, in that case, Keir Starmer, were duty-bound to respond to a manifesto proposal for and they waved it away by talking about Dad's Army. And what it's done is to trivialise the debate, as opposed to, it's set us back, I think, from where we should be, which is to be much closer to emulating what goes on in places like Sweden, where they have an honest, decent conversation with the public.
Just to say that it's really interesting watching this process in Germany now, because a couple of years ago, they had a really big reorganisation of the Bundeswehr, their armed forces, where they created a new Joint Force Services Command, whose job is essentially to coordinate the civil defence, all the stuff about what happens to the railways and the motorways, how you give the military priority, how you deal with the wounded who are coming back. And by the way, they're anticipating in a war scenario having to treat more than 1,000 casualties a day, which could be completely overwhelm the hospital system on a level incomparable even to COVID. Where the food supply is going to come from, how they're going to make sure they've got enough water if some of the water supplies are knocked out. And they've basically started doing all this about 12 months ago. And they're now looking at the Swedes and the Finns, but also at what the West Germans used to do during the Cold War, because, of course, the expectation always was that there might be a Soviet attack through the Fulda Gap. And I haven't really heard much about, if anything, analogous to that is happening in the UK, organisationally.
Well, just crickets.
But why crickets? I mean, if the Germans are having this conversation, why isn't it happening in the UK?
I can't answer that. I mean, I don't, it's beyond me, Oliver. You contrast on the one hand the extraordinarily high levels of support that exist in this country for Ukraine in facing down Russia. I mean, that's admirable. And we've had great political leadership. There's massive universal cohesion. But it's as if there's this complete gap between realizing that what is happening in Ukraine will happen in Europe tomorrow if we don't reset our defences, if we don't prepare for national resilience, if we don't deter Russia. And I hate to blame politicians and a lack of leadership, because I think, well, I know that politicians individually all understand the requirement, but they don't have the courage to explain this in a way that you see happening elsewhere. I think they have a problem clearly with bandwidth. And they also know that some of the fiscal choices they would have to make in order to follow through on this are deeply uncomfortable. And we've seen that playing out in the budget where, defence wasn't mentioned. I think the welfare budget is 5 times the size of the defence budget, and those are uncomfortable choices to make.
I think actually, you just answered your own question when you say, I don't know why this isn't happening. The word fiscal really explains absolutely everything. So you have, it's like a bow wave, isn't it, from the east. They got it first because the Russian threat is very, very imminent for them, and countries like Estonia and Finland have been occupied by Russia for hundreds of years in the past. The bow wave is slowly moving across Europe. It's in Germany, where we've been speaking about it. It's hit France, and yet our island of Britain seems to be impervious to it. And the simple reason is, if a politician accepts they've got a vast task here, you lay out the problem, we need to get into this pre-war mentality by a citizens' army, whatever it might be, it immediately have spending implications. And there's also a little bit of, do we worry the British public about this or not? Are we supposed to be here to fix problems, not alarming them? But park that aside. If you accept we need to rather drastically rearm to prevent a World War III rather than to fight one, deterrence being the best form of not having to fight any war, then you're talking about a massive budget uplift of, in the UK, 10, 20 billion pounds a year to get close to that sort of percentage spending, 3.5%, 5% of annual GDP. And that is money politicians need to show real grit to come up with. And if you look at Keir Starmer's government, they can't cut welfare spending. They tried that. They can't cut pension spending. They tried that too. Instead, they're having to increase taxes, as we saw for the last budget. So it's, if you like, a political cowardice, but it's also chicken and the egg, because unless you start talking about the problem, people aren't ever going to accept they're going to have to start paying for it through their taxes. And you're never going to get them to pay for it through their taxes if you don't start talking about the problem. So something sooner or later has to give on that.
And we haven't even mentioned President Trump and the US new national security strategy, which makes it incredibly clear that not only are we facing increased threats from the east, but we're getting reduced support from our west.
What gave Frederick Merz the political balls to talk about it where Keir Starmer doesn't, to put a very crass question to you, Ollie?
Well, like you said, it's fiscal. If you have the financial space to practice what you preach, then it opens up the possibility for you to say new things. And Germany has the structural great good fortune of having a relatively low amount of debt relative to its GDP, about 63% when Merz came into power. And it has the Bund, one of the most credible government bonds in the world. And so it can borrow at relatively low costs, and it can borrow credibly from the markets because they know it's not going to be overloaded with debt. And so they have the fiscal space that, for example, Rachel Reeves does not.
But other countries have had to make choices. I mean, whether you look at Sweden or Finland or the Baltic states or Poland, they are now having to spend money on guns, not butter. That presumably has come about because they've taken some cuts to public spending, to welfare budgets and so on.
They have in some cases raised things like consumption taxes and customs fees. There have been cases where they've frozen welfare outlay. But in a lot of cases, it is unfortunately true that they're just borrowing loads of money as well. So in Finland, the government deficit is something like 7% of GDP. And in Poland, it's 6.3% of GDP. So it's even more than Britain is borrowing. And the EU has basically said, well, go on, we're going to turn a blind eye and only really slap you on the wrist if you really take the mickey.
It's hard to avoid this one, isn't it? There is a 1930s, a late 1930s analogy going on here. We're in a process, certainly countries like Britain, of denialism.
Well, the famous quote from 1939, I think it was an anarchist French writer published, who will die for Danzig? Who in France would send their sons to go to Poland to fight against a German invasion? And this is now a question that I am hearing every time I go to Poland or the Baltic states from people in their governments, in their militaries, asking, are your British compatriots, are the Germans that you talk to in the government truly dependable? Would they actually come and fight for us, even though their armed forces are technically integrated into our command in the Enhanced Forward Presence battle groups? Would they really, really come to us if it came to it? And that level of insecurity is absolutely toxic.
So, I think I can answer that. We will die for Danzig because, as you've seen with your own eyes, we have what used to be we had an enhanced forward presence. So we have a British battle group along with, a subunit from the French and with other partners as part of that, integrated into the Estonian national defence plans. And on day one of any incursion or attack from Russia, we will be involved. And we will reinforce that, ideally in advance, if the indicators and warnings are there, with a brigade in order to prevent it from happening as a deterrence. So we will. The professional army, the regulars and the reserves, and the strategic reserve absolutely will. But I think the point you're making about this sort of doubts around society's commitment to the defence of Europe is absolutely crucial. And it brings us back to why this conversation needs to start now. I mean, if you go back to the 1930s, they had a very good reason for leaning into appeasement. Here is a generation that had experienced a war. All of the political leaders had served in the war, had served in the trenches. They desperately wanted to avoid it again. And it was only after Dunkirk, really, that British national morale and resilience, and we forget this, there was still widespread opposition to going to war. It was only after Dunkirk that we found our backbone.
So getting on to the nub of the question, which we've got a lot of listeners writing in about, actually, it's been a really interesting autumn, a regular theme, people wanting to say, well, look at what European countries are doing. Should we start looking at some form of conscription or not? Now, I know, Patrick, your view has always been any general will tell you, I prefer to have a volunteer army than a conscripted one, but they fight better. But what do you say to that argument that you might hear from, for example, my father or grandfather's generation of national service is a great thing to do because it toughens the young up, it teaches them discipline, might even give them a skill or two. So it's worth it alone. Conscription is worth it alone for those societal benefits that it also brings.
I've changed my mind on this. So you're absolutely right. For the vast majority of my career, I looked at the prospect of conscription with horror. Because it does professional armies no favours at all. It draws off resources that you can use to that you desperately need to increase the capability, the lethality, the professionalism of your existing army, and it distracts you. And it can also, as we've been hearing about, be really divisive in societies. But I think we have got to the point now where, first of all, we need this national conversation, and this is one way of provoking it. So my first step would be to focus on increasing the size of the regular army, increasing the size of the reserves, and making sure that we can draw into that strategic reserve. That's the first thing that you should do, because it doesn't undermine the army at a critical point in its modernization over the next few years. But I also think that in parallel, as part of a wider national defence plan, and wouldn't it be nice if we had a national defence plan, in the way that we've seen in places like Norway and Sweden and Finland, you have some form of selective national service in a way, or at least you begin to put the plans in place for it so that if the day comes, you are ready. What changed my mind was not just the strategic situation, the geostrategic situation, the threat, but actually seeing how well it works in Norway.
Mandatory call-ups, drafting, albeit on a small level, and you know how difficult it is politically to deliver that.
Don't make it about conscription first. First of all, let's make sure that we have an approach to total defence in the way that the Scandinavian countries do. But once you've had that conversation, it then makes the conversation about whether or not conscription a much more viable one.
Ollie, you're about the only one of the three of us who would be young enough to be conscripted if we had some form of it. You've just admitted you're 36. Are you ready to get signed up to fight?
I did combined cadet force in the RAF at school. I wasn't such a big fan of the square bashing, but the flying and the shooting were fun bits. And having seen conscripts in other countries, I think it would be not too much of a hardship. I have 3 small children, as you've just heard, at home, and I wrestle with this question a lot. But ultimately, they have to have a future in which they are alive and they have a society that's worth living in. So that is something I would very much be prepared to lay my life on the line for. Yeah, so I would be very much up for being conscripted. Okay.
On that note, we're going to have to let you go, Ollie. Thank you so much for being with us today. Your insight is absolutely fantastic. Whatever the time's paid to be in Berlin, it should be doubled, quite frankly, because you're such great value.
Please keep that bit in the edit.
Thanks, Ollie. I really enjoyed learning from you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been fun.
Well, that's it for this week. Before we go, we just wanted to tell you, though, that we've been shortlisted for another award, very excitingly. It's our second In-House Political Podcasts Awards Newcomer of the Year. So thank you very much to In-House for nominating us. As always, send your questions and comments our way. The email generalandjournalists@thetimes.co.uk. We love reading them and read every single one of them. And also subscribe to The Times' weekly newsletter on geopolitics and conflict. It's called War and Peace, and it's written by yours truly and drops in your inboxes every Thursday at noon. Free to Times subscribers. Until next week, bye, Patrick.
Bye, Tom.